Morning, can you hear me? Yes. Perfect. Welcome all to this panel, which is, there we are. Are we all OTTs, danger of regulating an undefined concept? Thank you very much. We have an stellar panel today. The main purpose of this panel and this roundtable is to interact and to get a clear idea about this concept and the boundaries of this concept in terms of regulation, which is one of the most important topics nowadays in terms of internet, in the internet field, and probably it's going to be one of the most important ones in the next years, on the years to come. So to address this issue, we have a super interesting panel, and that I would like to introduce briefly, Mr. Binton Cerf. Bint is a Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google. He contributes to global policy development and continues to spread the internet widely. Widely known as one of the fathers of internet, Bint is co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of internet. We have also Mr. Alexander Riobó. Alex is the Latin American Regulatory Director for Telefónica, and he's based in Sao Paulo. He has an electronic engineering degree from the University Javeriana in Colombia, and he has a Master of Technology and Innovation Management from the University of Sussex. At my right, Mr. Raúl Echeverría. Raúl is an old friend and Vice President of Global Engagement at ISOC. Among other things, Raúl was one of the founders of LACNIC, and he was chairman of the board of LACNIC between 2000 and 2012. When he is appointed as CEO, that's it. And he also has a lot of important positions in the internet field in the last 20 or 25 years. Natasha Jackson for GSMA. Natasha is Head of Public Policy and Consumer Affairs at GSMA, leading the association works on responsible approaches to trust and safety, including data privacy, security, and child online protection. We have Brett Solomon from Access Now. Brett is the Executive Director of Access Now, which is probably one of the most important international organizations dealing with freedom and other rights in the internet. We have Eric Loeb from AT&T. Eric is Senior Vice President for International, External, and Regulatory Affairs, where he's responsible for advocacy to international departments of the US government and all branches of the government outside the US. We have Mr. Robert Pepper. Dr. Pepper is Facebook Head of Global Connectivity Policy and Planning. Previously, he was Cisco's Vice President for Global Technology Policy for more than a decade, working with governments globally, helping to develop digital strategies, including the ICT and development. Finally, we have Bertrand de la Chapelle. Bertrand, he's the Executive Director of the Global Multi-Stakeholder Policy Network International Internet and Jurisdiction. He's a former member of the board of ICANN from 2006 and 2010. He was France thematic ambassador and a special envoy for the Information Society. He is a well-known face in the IGF space, and this is our panel. So as you can see, well, we have a lot of things to do and to talk. Let me explain you the rules of engagement for this panel and the order of the speakers, because some of them will have to leave early to the main session, so we will try to maximize the time we have with them. So we have suggested to them a couple of questions regarding these topics, and we are going to have an initial round of 5 minutes of interventions from each of them. After that, we are going to open the mic for some comment or questions coming from the floor, and after that, we are going to have our second round of questions and interaction with the public. Let me remind you, while you are interacting with the panel, please be respectful, and if you can, short and brief, because as a sign of respect, not only for the panelists, but for the rest of the audience and the people who wants to comment, because we have a limited time, unfortunately. So after explaining that, let me open the mic to our first panelist, been served. And the question that we have suggested, the first one is, what do we understand when we talk about OTTs? And sub-questions that we might have addressed, are all OTT services provided to the internet OTTs? Should we classify them separately? Please, Ben.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for a kind introduction. I'll make this very simple. The internet was designed as a neutral platform for packet switching, on top of which anything that you could packetize and transmit could be implemented. Over the course of the last 40 years, the capacity of the system to carry these simple and uninterpreted packets has increased by a factor of 1 million. The original design had a backbone that went at 50,000 bits per second on the ARPANET. Today, you find 50 gigabits to 100 gigabits per second is very common, and even higher speeds are coming. The edges of the net have also increased in capacity. Why is that important? Well, it's important because the applications that can be supported on this simple neutral platform have expanded dramatically from simple text exchanges in the earliest days now to full speed, high definition video, interactive conferencing, and a variety of other applications. So the notion of OTT, in my view, is simply a misunderstanding of the design of this system. Everything is an application on top of this underlying high-speed packet switched network. And so the idea of regulating that seems to me completely out of character. It's unnecessary. It's unnecessary to regulate all of those applications that we can do now and the applications that will be invented in the future. It's simply all enhanced application space. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to stop there and encourage the rest of the discussion to continue.
Thank you, Bert. Our next speaker is going to be Mr. Alex Riobo from Telefónica.
Hello, good morning to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. Thank you, Gonzalo. Well, it is a very difficult question, where or not to regulate OTTs. And well, to answer to that question, I would say we have to look at it from different angles, from different perspectives. There is an economic regulation, and from that perspective, we have to look what is that regulation for. That regulation was created in the 80s when the public utility companies were privatized. But at the time it made sense. It made sense because there were natural monopolies. There was only one provider for water and sanitation services, one provider for electricity, and there was also only one provider for fixed telecommunications. So the regulation made sense at that time. But things change in the telecom world, and new technologies emerge. And then it didn't make sense to control the tariffs that those providers were charging to customers, or the conditions in which they were providing their services. And that regulation change shifted from the objective to promote competition, and that's the only purpose of regulation, is to promote competition. So now in the digital ecosystem, we have to think differently. We are not talking anymore about the telecommunications industry that has changed. We're talking about the digital ecosystem in which a lot of agents, different agents, compete and cooperate, because well, we wouldn't have the networks we have today if there weren't those contents and applications that we use every day and that make our lives easier. But there won't be applications and contents if there wouldn't be networks. So we compete and we cooperate. And from that perspective, we would have to analyze in which of the new markets within that ecosystem there is enough competition and in which there is not. I will say, for instance, when you make a phone call, you don't care if you are making that phone call from the WhatsApp application or from your cellular provider. So, in that perspective, well, the answer will be no. It doesn't make sense to regulate a market in which there is more competition now than it were some years ago. But there are some new markets in that ecosystem that have to be reviewed. And in those new markets, well, the answer, I don't know if it's good to regulate or not those markets. First, we will have to analyze if there is enough competition. So to make it simple, in some markets, there won't be necessary to regulate OTTs. The answer will be to deregulate the former incumbents, which have more competition today than it had before. But in some other, we will have to analyze, and each country had to analyze regarding their national frameworks and decide where or not some of those new markets need regulation.
Thank you very much, Alex. Robert Pepper, because I know that you have to leave early. And
thank you very much. Yeah, so unfortunately, I apologize. I have to leave early because we have a main session that I invite you to when this is over. But it's the main session on sustainable development, internet, and inclusive growth in the main room. But let me go back and start sort of framing my views on this, aligning really with Vint, as we usually do. That's right. You know, the old guys with the gray beards. That's right. There's a symbiotic relationship between the application providers, online service providers. Some people call them OTTs. I'm not sure what OTT means. It's because it is about applications, right? But there's a symbiotic relationship between the application providers and the underlying network providers, the transmission networks. Without, you know, the online content is driving demand for the broadband networks. And of course, as was just pointed out by our colleague from Telefonica, without the networks, there'd not be the connectivity. I also think that it's clear, and so we just heard, as the market evolves, the notion of what applications and what services, you know, either rely on one another or compete with one another is blurring. And in a market where there is more competition, there is less need to regulate. And in fact, there are regulations on traditional telcos that actually have become outdated as there's more competition. And all too often, the regulators, there's a lag in the time between competition and the assessment or the review of those regulations in order to deregulate, perhaps. But let me just, there's also some fundamental differences between the online services and the applications and the underlying networks. But those differences really also are the result of a fundamental change in the networks themselves and the services. If you go back 30 years and before, there were 5 essential assumptions that underlaid the entire telecommunications industry, both the business and the regulation. And they were correct 30, 40 years ago. Number 1, the product was voice. Number 2, the metric by which you measured it, billed for it, paid for it, and regulated it was the minute. And using sort of economic principles, if you have what we call the traffic sensitive or an incremental cost, a traffic sensitive cost or an incremental cost, you would have a traffic sensitive or incremental price. So the longer you talk, the higher the cost. So there were per minute charges. The longer you talked, the more you paid. The longer the distance, the higher the cost. So you had charges. Where you were located affected the cost, and so there were different prices based upon location. But today's networks are completely different, and this is Vince's point, I think. Today, the product is connectivity. The metric is bandwidth, and the networks, you're either on or off. They are time, traffic, distance, location insensitive. So trying to think about imposing the old pricing regulatory structures on these new flat IP broadband networks in which it's just packets doesn't make sense. And trying to have regulation on the applications that ride on top of those networks as though they were inextricably linked to transmission in the old days of telephony makes no sense. So we really need a completely different way about thinking about the regulation and really understand this symbiotic relationship between the transmission, the networks, and all of the applications that ride on top. One last point, for example, in 4G, LTE, there is no voice like there was in 2G or 3G. The voice is voice over IP on top of the network. It happens to be called voice over LTE or VoLTE, but it's voice over IP. It's nothing more than an application. Right? So thinking about regulating that as though it was traditional voice from 40 years ago makes no sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Natasha, I hear that you have a presentation.
It's okay.
It's all right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Good.
So I think we're in danger of violently disagreeing, which is always really boring for a panel session at somewhere like the IGF. But the world is different. It's definitely different. And at the GSMA, with the Association for Mobile Operators around the world, when we try and understand and talk about OTTs, really we think you need to start by looking at their role within the digital ecosystem and what is that ecosystem. And really, if it's so rich and it's so varied and there are so many different actors within it, whether they're coming from the content side, connectivity, whether they're providing the sort of user connectivity or the interfaces. There are such a multitude of actors and business models and commercial relationships within it that it's absolutely huge. And at the center of this sort of digital ecosystem, we see these digital platforms, which are essentially combinations of the hardware, the apps, the content, and the communications coming together to provide services to users, whether they're video game services, social media, music services, whatever they may be. They're essentially collections of digital platforms, and OTTs are no other than one of these digital platforms that connects different groups of users, enabling new business models, new commercial models, and different relationships. And primarily they do so by leveraging innovation and scale and reducing the costs. And often they offer these at zero cost, not always, it depends on the business model. So you have this variety of business models that are constantly changing because what we have really is really dynamic competition within that ecosystem. Companies are competing all the time on creating new products, new services, entering the market, lowering the cost models, and the innovation rates are so high, and often you have this very disruptive innovation that we see every 2 to 3 years. So OTTs, as we're calling them, are naturally testing the boundaries of these existing laws and regulations, which were designed, as Dr. Pepper said, for a bygone era that was based on traditional telecommunications. So we see that the challenge, again, for regulation is not to apply rigid definitions that have existed in the past, but really to understand how these different actors and business models work, and put into place new regulatory frameworks that support the investment and the innovation that we really need in order to continue to deliver huge benefits from the ecosystem for consumers and for businesses.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Brett?
Hi, so Brett Solomon from Access Now. So honoured to be here, particularly with Vince Cerf. It's always great to sit on a panel with the person who invented the thing that you're discussing. I'm a representative from civil society, and it's also great to be on a panel with businesses and business associations. Obviously, well, our perspective is one from that of the user, not necessarily about competition or about market access or about holding on to existing parts of markets, but about how is the user actually able to experience and enjoy the internet. And I think it's really essential that we see this through the human rights framework. How do you ensure that the user is able to experience the right to freedom of expression, opinion, association, the right to privacy, and so on? When we come to OTT, I think it's important that we look at actually what is the genesis of this concept and whether it's an appropriate term to be using in the context of not only the users of the internet now, but the users of the internet in the future. And of course, there's a number of billion users still to join us. And we want to make sure that they're able to experience those rights in a way that existing users do. So to that end, I think that this concept of regulation is important to see in the frame of how do we ensure the continued openness of the internet, and how do we ensure regulation, if it is to take place, supports the user's rights to be able to, as I say, express, to think, to publish, etc. Our concern is, and I think as you look across many different jurisdictions, this concept of OTT regulations threatens those rights. So it threatens the openness and the ability for innovation, for new services, for new players to be able to enter into a market. And so very much in support of any form of regulation that supports only those rights. So for instance, in the European context, there's discussion around the e-privacy directive, and which has traditionally been relevant only to the telecom sector, and whether it should, as a privacy protection, be applicable to or apply to OTT, so-called OTT or application services. In which case, we think that there is a good argument for that. But when it's actually about competition or trying to protect incumbents' position, we think that there's some serious questions about freedom of expression and opinion and innovation that are potentially at risk as a result of that. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Brett. Bertrand de la Chapelle.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I do expect that my presence here is not to represent some form of government. I'm not in there anymore. The second thing is, I'm not sure that after the previous interventions, people have a strong sense of why there is a problem. Because there seems to be a relative convergence that the environment is changing, that there needs to be adaptation. But fundamentally, the question that we are being asked here is this concept and this word an operational word to describe the problems that we're facing? And I suppose that one of the reasons why I've been invited here is because as an executive director of Internet and Jurisdiction, it's more a contribution on the methodological aspect than on the substantive aspect, really. And one of the big challenges in most of those discussions regarding governance on the internet in general is that we're often in situations where people, entities, government, civil society, companies, and so on, have a problem with each other. So they throw accusations over the fence saying, you don't do this, you should do that, you shouldn't do this, or you should do that. And in most cases, the reason why there is those fights is because there is an underlying question that needs to be formulated as a common challenge rather than a problem that people have with each other. And to be absolutely frank, when Gonzalo invited me to come to this panel, I was struggling with the very concept of OTT and whether it's operational or not. And I dug a little bit deeper, I spoke with a few people. And actually, the more I was thinking about it, the more I felt that there are a few underlying, I would say, two fundamental questions. But there's one underlying question, which is much more of a common challenge than a problem that people have with each other, which is very simply, how can we collectively and collaboratively ensure that the necessary growth in the infrastructure to accommodate the needed bandwidth and the universal access can be financed? That's the fundamental question that we're all facing. And most of the debate that has been going on, as I understand, particularly in this region or in Latin America, but also in other regions, is a sort of rehashing of the discussion that took place around the net neutrality debate. And if you look at the question of how can we collectively finance the infrastructure to cope with the increased need of bandwidth and to ensure universal access, then it becomes a different challenge. And it is becoming more and more obvious that regulation, to take the second term in this title, is a very loose word to describe a lot of different things, and some of those things are mainly cooperations. It has been said over and over again that there is a symbiotic relationship, and that of course the need for bandwidth is linked to the availability of applications, and that the applications could not exist if the bandwidth is not there. There are many different challenges, whether you're talking about last mile connectivity, fiber to the home, in urban areas or in rural areas, whether you're talking about the special needs for spectrum that people have to allow mobile access in broadband. There are a lot of different issues, but one of the main challenges that I have with the way the problem seems to be framed, seen from the outside, is that it looks very much like the classical issue of how do you divide a fixed pie, rather than discussing how the whole ecosystem can grow in a collaboration together. And I think this panel is an opportunity to highlight the need for those questions to be discussed in collaboration with the different actors. When you see that today, some of the largest OTTs or applications are developing their own infrastructure, and that most of the telecom operators are going into the content area and the provision of applications, it is clear that the distinction between those layers is blurring sufficiently for requiring more of a cooperative approach. So in my perspective, if this panel can serve one purpose, is to encourage all the different actors to formulate and frame the problem in a way that becomes a common problem rather than the problem that they have with each other, because otherwise they can continue forever. And the final point on the question of regulation, I find very interesting that in the different presentations, there are two dimensions of regulation that have been evoked in passing. One is the promotion of competition, which is one tool, but the other one is the regulation that Brett was mentioning that is more related to content, privacy, and so on. These are two different types of regulation, and I think it's important to distinguish them.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. Eric?
Great. Gonzalo, thanks, and thanks so much also for organizing the panel and bringing everyone together. I'll be relatively brief for thoughts on this first part because I think I'll live up to the famous saying in Washington, D.C. that everything's been said, but not everyone has said it. I'll avoid that if I can. But a point that we have coalesced on, and this is just one to reflect, 5 years from now, there will be no panel called OTT. It's a term with a limited shelf life, and it is a concept that, because of the dramatic changes in technology and commercial models, it just sits out there as a false dichotomy. If you think of the operations and practices of companies, the convergence as a word means so many things, but it's not just at a services and service provider level, which is how people think about it. It's that people that have started at the edge have moved to build networks, and people who build networks, particularly as you think of a software-defined network ecosystem, everything, as Vince said, is an application. So the utility of a concept of thinking about regulatory structures and regulatory models through a dichotomy of OTT versus telco, et cetera. It's not very sensible. So we'll get to the interesting point, I think, in a moment of, so what does the future look like and how should we be thinking about important policymaking terms? Because likewise, it's not a correct dichotomy, as Pepper was saying, to think that inherently you apply all regulations in one and not the other, or vice versa. So there's a very interesting and sophisticated conversation to have so that we think in a going forward manner, to Natasha's point of regulatory modernization, of what are the things we value, to Brett's point, what do we value from social policy, safety policy, economic policy, as core components that are important across jurisdictions. And then, in a careful way, how do we think in refreshed ways that work and encourage innovation and investment for everybody in all the spaces to apply these in a manner that brings out the best and does not unnecessarily stifle based on historic models and frameworks?
Thank you very much, Eric. And finally, in this first round of interventions, Raul Echeverria.
Good morning, everybody. It's difficult to be original in the speech, being the last one in the panel. But I think that's I work for the Internet Society, so I think that's the name of the organization says a lot, is the Internet Society. So we look to the Internet as an Internet as a whole. So we really don't see any application over the Internet because there are many things over the Internet, but not the things that we are talking about. We see that the applications are part of the Internet. Of course, when we are using one application, we say, I'm using Internet. We don't say, I'm using something that is up the Internet. So I think that's probably, we could speak about things that are on the top rather than over the top. Maybe we can still continue using the acronym OTTs, but with a different meaning that is on the top. And but what are the OTTs? Even that's I think that's I made this clarification, but I think that's when we talk, everybody knows that's what we are talking about. So it's just a conceptual clarification. But with the increasing adoption of technology and ICTs specifically in every human and economic activity, we see applications coming up everywhere, doing many different things. I think that all of them could be considered in the same category of being on the top of the internet. Is a newspaper, an electronic newspaper. The most famous journalist in Uruguay that used to work for a radio for many years. Now he has his own online radio, and he changed the business model. Now he's making contracts with the traditional radios for delivering his content through the radios, but mainly he delivers the content over the internet. And so that's when we speak about a newspaper or an electronic e-government services, that is another example of on-the-top applications, or Uber. Uber is also an OTT. It's under this understanding, or anything. That's all the things that we have in mind could be considered as that. And so, but sometimes we speak about things that are replacing or substituting or changing traditional business models. And as the example that I mentioned about the journalist, is everything is changing things. And we are discussing about Uber everywhere around the world because it's very disruptive application. And so this is so what we could consider an OTT. I think that's we should discuss in any case all the complete range of the broad range of applications and things that are changing the things that we use in the way that we use it to do so far. But when we discuss about OTT, it seems that we are looking only to just a small part of that. That is what has been named communications OTTs. That's are the ones that are improving, replacing, substituting, or changing the traditional communications ways or other former applications that and this is, in my view, this is just is a small part of that. In fact, the disruption is much bigger in other areas, much bigger. So that's so when I still try to answer the first question, that is, what do we understand when we talk about OTTs? I don't know exactly. I think that's we tried in this business, the people in this community try to limit the conversation about OTTs to the communication area, but this is a much bigger thing. So that's, should we classify them separately? No idea. I think that we will, and while we take the time for classifying the OTTs, probably there will be other 100 categories of things that will come up that we are not seeing today. Thank you.
Super interesting. Thank you very much, Raul. Now we are open the floor for some questions. Let's see if.
Would you permit a response from the panel to what the panelists have said?
Yes. Okay. Okay, well, let's be innovative and flexible. So let's say that we are going to open some 5 minutes to responses, and then we can go to the questions. Okay? So I suppose that you're the first in line. So go ahead.
Well, I also want to point out that I didn't use my whole 5 minutes either. So what was that? I paid for this microphone. I like very much the point that the focus on OTTs has been so narrow to a set of services or businesses that used to be done a different way. But the internet is capable of doing an incredible range of applications, most of which haven't been invented yet. And so the first person, maybe it's you, invent a new application that no one else offers. Oh my God, it's a monopoly. You're the only person that offers this brand new service. We have to regulate you because no one else is competing yet. This is ridiculous. What's important is promoting people's new ideas and inventions and products and services. And so the whole idea behind this uniform, neutral platform upon which new competitive services can be built is really important. I do want to come, though, to the other point about what else do we care about? We certainly care about user choice. We want users to have the ability to choose from multiple suppliers. That's competition. And sometimes you may need some kind of regulatory framework to assure that there is competition so that the users have choice. So I stop there, and thank you very much for allowing me the extra intervention.
Thank you very much. Is there any other comment or no? Okay. So okay, so we have 1, 2, and 3 questions here, and let's see. We are going to start with 3, and let's see if we can have the time. But I would like to remember that if we can, we are going to have some time at the end of the session for some other questions. So when you are, please introduce yourself and
my name is Virat Bhatia. I'm a MAG member. Usually I would have just listened to this panel and sort of got out applauding, but there is so much agreement in it that I'm almost duty-bound to introduce a difficult question, just for the robustness of the discussion. I also chair the largest industry association of ICT in India, which has all the representation. I had the great privilege of hosting Mr. Cerf, and my boss serves on the panel here, so as full disclosure, I'm a telco. We get this kind of discussion in our meetings in India, where all people come together and have this very cozy agreement saying, this is where we need to go. It's a difficult problem, but we need to sort of look at this. Then we reach the offices of the government, more specifically intelligence agencies, not security agencies. And they ask us the following question: why is it that you want us to regulate SMSs and phone calls, but not regulate a WhatsApp message? Do you think terrorists are fools? In a terror-prone country where we lose hundreds of people and human lives are pitched against human rights, they come up to us and ask us this question: on how do you want us to save lives? How do you want us to make sure that we have the information that we require to save lives? Because the OTT platforms, currently at least, stand outside the traditional surveillance mechanisms that the intelligence agencies require to get the basic information on terror. So if the panel could inform us on what is the response we can take back to not security agencies, but intelligence agencies who don't come to meetings like this, but write the rules which then regulate this entire ICT sector. How do we pitch human right versus human lives and equality between two types of services, which one of them could be used outside the traditional surveillance system, and the other is regulated, costing millions of dollars of investment in making sure that the surveillance is accurate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you see the screen, we have indicated the second suggested questions for the panelists, and I think that some of the issues that you are raising are going to be discussed in that. But nevertheless, if one of the panelists wants to address briefly.
Just quickly, so firstly, the right to life is a human right. So it's not as if we're pitching the right to life against, human life versus human rights. I think it's important, it's actually the most important right, and all rights are indivisible as well. So there's no pitting. It's about how do you ensure that people enjoy their rights across the spectrum. And that includes, as you're talking about national security and intelligence agencies, this brings up the right to privacy and the right to freedom of expression. And I think it's incumbent upon all states who are signatories to the International Human Rights Conventions to ensure that all citizens are able to enjoy those rights, even in the context of the terrorist age. And the answer to that, or the antidote to that, is the rule of law, is that there should be the ability for national security and intelligence agencies to access user data when there is necessity and proportionality. And there are principles that have been developed, including the necessary and proportionate principles, which 400 civil society organisations have signed, that lay out a rule of law approach and a regulatory approach to ensuring that we can all live safely in the digital age and in the context of terrorist attacks.
Just a quick answer, because I like your question very much, because it brings me to the second approach I wanted to talk about. From the competitive perspective, the more competition you have in a given market, the less regulation you need. I mean, I think we all agree on that. But there is another type of regulation that you mentioned that has to do with security of the citizens in a country. Every state has the obligation to protect their citizens. That's something I think we don't have to discuss. And for doing that, all citizens and companies providing services or selling products in a country have to collaborate with authorities. From my perspective, it doesn't matter whether you have headquarters in that country or not. You should collaborate with authorities in a given state, because there is life we are talking about. So from that perspective, I think regulation should be analyzed in a different matter. And I repeat, I think we all are obliged to comply with and collaborate with authorities in any country.
Thank you, Alex. I think that we are going to have enough time, in the next slot. So let's move to the next question. We are going to take 3 at this point. I point that gentleman with the blue hat, and then. Sorry? Sorry, I can hear you.
Can I ask a question if there is time afterwards all these questions that are in line?
We are going to have time at the end of the panel for more questions.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is James Nolofie. I'm the chair of the Africa ICT Alliance, made up of 27 countries with ICT Association and some concerned companies in Africa. Well, recently, the Nigerian regulator asked that telco could actually increase the cost of data, and people protested, the parliamentarians intervened, and the cost went down. Well, the justification for them is that they want small players to still remain in market, to still be available in this system. So the point is, the question is, what is the thinking of the panelists concerning that? Though the issue is still on, though they have stepped down on increases in the cost of data, but with all the intervention of the panelists, I think competition needs to be allowed. But what is your thinking or take in this regard?
Thank you very much. Well, again, that's an issue, a point that we are supposed to address during the second round of interventions, but I don't know if you want to. Okay, 1 point.
When you mention cost, I assume you mean cost to the small business provider. The cost to the provider of data services is also an important number. And if it turns out that they're charging much more than the real cost, that's an opportunity for competition. And we've seen this happen in the past, where new technology comes along and makes it less expensive to offer a particular data service, for instance, and competition happens as long as it's permitted to happen.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Christoph.
I wanted to ask a question. Christoph Steck from Telefonica. I think I want to go back to a concept, I think, which was clear, and Brett, I think, put it out clearly. The guide to all these kind of analysis we have to do and all this kind of modernization of regulation is, I think, to go back to consumers and go back to users and to see where there are values we need to protect. I mean, what are we really trying to do here? And I think the privacy aspect is a good one, because up to now we had a regime where you had in the telco world a very specific regime of privacy protection, freedom of communication, I mean secrecy of your communication and so on. And this is currently in most parts of the world not applicable to the digital world. So basically the authorities are not looking into that, the laws are not up to speed on that. So, I mean, my question would be, going back to that, I mean, how can we do that? I mean, I do not care if my location data comes out of a connected car, out of my smartphone, out of an application on a smartphone. I mean, there's so many different ways now where data is collected and it's basically used by companies or by others. So how can we do that? I mean, do we have the right institutional frameworks to do that? Because most countries do not even have data protection authorities who have the capacity. When you come to competition, I mean, who would do that? We have in the telco world regulators with hundreds of people watching what's happening on telco markets. I mean, there's nothing for that for the whole digital economy. So, I mean, this is a massive change of what we have done in the past, and it's happening very quickly. So how can we do this kind of change to this new world?
Thank you. Very interesting question. So, Brett, I hear your name during the question, but I don't know what to.
So thanks for raising that, and I do think that the regulatory spectrum is clearly important at times to ensure rights, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks. Like for instance, in India, the gentleman I think who just left referred to. I mean, the situation there is that there isn't a privacy law in place, and yet at the same time, there are numerous initiatives for so-called OTT regulation. So how do you actually ensure privacy protections in the context of a country of 1 billion people that doesn't actually have a law that protects those rights? So these are some of the challenges, and I think the speed with which we actually maneuver, and then also just I think there is a level of trust that we have to have in the environment, in a relatively unregulated environment, that it has worked relatively well to this point. I think this sort of push towards over-regulation, unless it's regulation that protects the openness or protects the digital rights of the internet's users, then we're at risk of preventing the sorts of things that I mentioned before, like innovation and openness.
Thank you, Brett. I think that Natasha wants to, and Bertrand, you're going to have an extra minute for your last intervention.
Okay, yes. So very quickly, yes, absolutely agree. We need to look at the consumer perspective on this. And I think we'll talk about this in the next part of the panel, but I think incredibly important in this area is really capacity building for governments and regulators in this area. So not just in the case where we're talking previously around terrorist or security alerts, that they understand how the different players in the ecosystem work and to what extent they're able to affect different actions and have impacts or not in important, and also for regulators to understand these new frameworks and understand and open up the thinking in terms of looking at things from a different way in the future. So capacity building around the world, and particularly in those parts of the world where they don't have any of the sort of necessary consumer protections in place, is something important. And it's something that the GSMA is doing, and we do around the world already in workshops with regulators and government.
Since I've got the microphone, just one point. You know, Einstein said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. It's very important for the regulators to understand that they can't keep doing the same thing over and over, and they even have to think about maybe not regulating something is a good idea.
Okay, that's cool. We are going to stop the questions for this section now, since we are running a little bit late. And this is what we are going to do. We have a second round of suggested questions for our panelists. Now we are going to ask you to, I don't know, to take your intervention up to 3 minutes. I know that some of you have to leave early, so, and after that we are going to open the mic and the floor for questions again. I'm going to start with Raul, and then we are going to move in the exact opposite order that we had in the first round. So, because Raul, I think that you have to leave soon. No. You're fine? Okay, cool.
Thank you. I have been a very good student, respecting all the rules, but I will follow the example of my mentor, Bin Cerf. So now that I have the mic, I have the power, and I will speak all the time that I Okay, is the regulation, I think that's, Brett said something in his first speech, that we have to look at this issue from the point of view of the public interest, for the user perspective. And also I would add the regional and local characteristics of perspective, because it's not the same, the situations or measures are not the same in different parts of the world. So it is not, we have to stop discussing these issues just as something between the telcos and the content providers. At least this is not the discussion that I'm interested in participating in. So I'm look to this point from the perspective of the public interest. So about the question itself, about the regulation. Well, first of all, is that regulation is not the only public policy tool. It's just one of them. There are many other things, many other tools for policymakers. There is, yes, a risk on regulating those things. And I will come back to Virat's question. That's, I'm sorry that we don't have answers for that question. Probably the question is not the right one. And because we have to look at that as different business with different regulations. And also, we don't think I don't think that's we have to discuss as regulation, yes or not. I think there are room for some regulations, maybe, I don't know, but it doesn't mean that we have to apply exactly the same regulation frameworks to different activities. And look at what is happening with Uber. And there is a risk, first of all, in an issue of timing. We have been discussing around the world for 2 years what to do with Uber, and there is not a consensus yet. And we are starting to see some progress on the regulation. It's a very light regulation everywhere. It's not the same regulation that's having regulated the taxis and other things. But while we are discussing this, we have now more connected cars, we have driverless cars. In fact, I saw a few months ago that one European city has already a public transportation bus, driverless, that is just a pilot experience. So we don't know yet how to regulate Uber, and we have more challenging situations on the same field. But what could we do? So we should regulate that for protecting some economic interests from disruption. I don't think that we will be doing a good favor to them, because if we do that, we kill the innovation. In fact, if we just protect everybody, if we protect the hotels from Airbnb, the taxis from Ubers, if we protect the telcos from the use of WhatsApp, so we will be using SMS for 20 more years. We will continue taking the same taxis that are not providing a good service. So I think that's it's not the right question. It's if we have to apply the same regulation frameworks. It's different situation, and the solutions for that for the present challenges are not in the past, are in the future. And to be honest, I think that we talk all the time about the information society or knowledge society. I really feel that we are in the innovation society at this moment. And I think that all the society and the countries, if we want to look at the world in terms of countries, they have really the challenge of reaching a certain threshold of innovation. And the countries that don't do that, they will be the loser. The ones that are really able to have a level of innovation over that threshold will be the winners. And when we speak about innovation, we speak also about innovation in public policies. And this is a very important aspect. We have to be more creative in the ways that we deal with the current problems. And I think that what Bin says is very appropriate. That's we cannot continue doing always the same, and we'll look for different situations. Personally, and my last point, I would like to see some improvements in some of the OTTs that we are talking about. I would like to be improvements in interoperability. I would love to send a message from Skype to a colleague that have WhatsApp. That would be amazing. I would love to be improvements also in privacy or personal data protection. I don't know if regulation is enforceable, is useful, if it is the right way to deal with that. I'm convinced that the multi-stakeholder approach is the approach for dealing with these challenges. And this is why we are here, because we believe in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we have a really, really very limited time. I would love to spend hours and hours and hours talking about this issue, and especially with this panel, which is really, really interesting, but we need to stick on our agenda. So I think that Eric Bertrand. Yeah, I'm getting old. Sorry.
That's okay. So we had two keywords in the title. One was OTT and the other one was regulation. So we very aptly deconstructed the OTT and decided that it's basically not an apt distinction. Now regarding regulation, we have already seen that there are many different types of regulations. And I want to come very concretely to the question that Virat was asking, because this was an issue that was not necessarily implied in the discussion, which is fundamentally the core question of cross-border access to user data when there is a criminal investigation in one country, which begets the whole question of the distinction of the regime between the operators that have to get a license in the country and the operators that are across borders. One of the major benefits of the internet was the fact that services could be accessible from anywhere in the world without having to ask for a license of any sort. This is a fundamental value of the internet. And I must confess that a lot of the trends that are happening at the moment are going in the opposite direction because a certain number of issues are not being solved. And because the issues like the one that Virat is addressing are not being solved, you get the blocking of WhatsApp in some countries in Latin America. You get the trend towards data localization, which is technically a nonsense when it's compulsory. But you have a whole range of actors who are struggling with solving this fundamental question. To get very concrete, you get a crime committed in India. The criminal is located in India. The victim is located in India. There's a perfect legitimate jurisdiction for the Indian government to prosecute this crime. Depending on whether the data that has to be accessed is hosted by an internet service provider that has a license in India and an obligation to transmit this information, or whether it's the data that is stored by Google because of Gmail or because of a WhatsApp application, it is stored outside by a company that is located outside. The rules are different, and everybody's struggling at the moment to find the right balance of interests regarding under which condition this data should or shouldn't be transmitted. To add to the complexity of the problem, which is one of the ones that is addressed in the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network that I manage, you have regulation in the US that forbids the companies that are based in the US to transmit information regarding users in criminal investigation when it is the content of an exchange, like the content of an email, but allows the voluntary transmission without any agreed framework at the moment of the basic subscriber information and the traffic data. So it is a complex issue where there is a discrepancy in the rules. And one thing that is very clear is that the solution is not to apply a licensing agreement to the cross-border services. But there is a need to find a solution, and actually there will be another panel at 12 in the workshop 87 in room 3 that will be dealing more precisely with this question. But the question of how do national laws apply to cross-border services and the jurisdictional challenges that go with it is one of the fundamental underlying problems. And regulation is too vague a word to cover this. There are very different types of regulation. We regulate content, you regulate access to user data, you regulate the competition market, and you can go on and on. So I think it's important to deconstruct the word and look at the different types of regulation. But cross-border access to user data is one of the situations where there's a big difference.
Well, that's really, really interesting, Bertrand, and probably we'll talk about it, at noon. So, Eric?
Okay. I thought I'd just add a couple of concepts from a framework perspective as we think of the premise that we got to fairly quickly, that at least for that category of activities people most think of as OTT, over time it's to be thinking about things as services, service providers, what end users are using and consuming. And for some of the things that Christophe had raised, it's helpful to think of both a horizontal and a vertical axis. There are going to be certain issues for which there's an appropriate expectation of horizontal consistency. And over time, that could be privacy, and it can be security, it could be disability access. There are certain things that there will be public policy expectations, end user expectations to be provided, and then an expectation for some manner of horizontal consistency regardless of what type of company it is, but focus on what kind of service it is. At the same time, on the vertical axis, you have to be mindful that there are going to be very different types of activities for which you don't apply all the same things. A connected car is not a voice service, is not a connected refrigerator, right? And so there are going to be distinctions below or above that level, that horizontal plane where differentiation is appropriate. A second point that I think is important to consider in terms of that public-private engagement in how we address these policy priorities is a different focus on what from how. And the what is very important. What it is that public policy identifies should be addressed, should be protected through some manner. The how comes down to the different, sometimes very innovative ways or different technological ways that someone can address that. And where possible, in thinking of policy and regulation, it's helpful to, whenever you can, avoid that prescriptive approach on the how to allow people to solve things in a pretty dynamic way. And a third point I'll make on all of this, and it comes very much to Bertrand's point, we can talk about all of this, but for many of the different changes that take place, it's not just a regulatory decision, it's a legislative one. And so there are going to be a lot of instances where for the framework with which public sector can act to be applied in a more modernized way is actually going to require some legislative changes.
Thank you, Eric. I think that's Brett. It's your turn. Natasha?
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, I think we've all agreed that policymakers need to take a fresh approach and a new look at the regulatory approach that they're taking based on the changes that we've seen. So really what we're saying is that the future needs a more technology agnostic approach in regulation and a much more flexible approach. And I'm going to do a shameless plug now because we worked with NERA Consulting earlier this year to come up with what that new regulatory framework might be. And we published a report this year. And it really is based on 3 fundamental principles, and I think Eric has picked up on them as well. So first of all, that regulation has to be functionality-based rather than structure-based. So it should focus on looking at the functionality of the services rather than the industry structure or the players or the technology. And for example, if the purpose of regulation is to protect consumers from some sort of harm associated with a service or something around it, they should look at that regardless of the type of player who's providing that or the technology that's underlying on that. And the second principle is that because these markets are so dynamic and complex, regulation needs to be really flexible and to accommodate all the changes that we've heard and we know are coming. So in principle, performance-based sort of ex-post approaches to regulation are going to be better than prescriptive, rigid ex-ante rules. So we think it's much better that they set performance-based standards rather than being prescriptive on regulations that can't be adapted or keep up and will rapidly become outdated. And the third principle in terms of the new frameworks is really that regulators really need to recognize that today's regulations, and many of them that have been inherited from the past, are obsolete, and really take a bottom-up approach to looking not only at new regulation but the existing regulation, and so not necessarily ignoring existing rules and starting over, but actually taking the current and the future into account. And in this report that we have, and there are copies at GSMA stand here if you want to get copies of it, it goes into much more detail in certain areas of regulation, whether that's access or privacy and data protection or spectrum policy. And so we've laid it out, and we really believe that, and we have no doubt that countries who really choose to modernize their regulatory frameworks to reflect the new market and the new digital ecosystem will reap the benefits, whether that's investment or innovation, consumer choice, and economic growth.
Thank you, Natat.
Thanks. I'm really pleased actually that there is some consensus around the kind of the false construction of OTT. I think that if we can start to move past that concept, it would be really good. But the reality is that there's actually legislation that's being proposed in pretty much every jurisdiction that that we all live in, particularly in the global south. And if we look at Brazil, for instance, I mean, there's significant. I mean, we had 100 million WhatsApp users, 100 million users, kicked off. They're unable to communicate with each other, and there's a whole range of push towards regulation around WhatsApp, which, as I think as Bertrand kind of indicated in the context of there being this uncertainty, like these are the sorts of results that we see from the courts. In Morocco this year, they began with blocking of VoIP. In Argentina, there's the 17 principles, which talk very much about obligations to register applications and establish dangerous intermediary liability rules. In Colombia, there's a bill in Congress about transportation services, which mandates application registration, which gives unbelievable powers to the authorities in Uruguay, in India, you name it. And much of this is still under the banner of OTT. So I think it's really important that we actually respond to those regulatory developments and understand the consequences for the future of the open internet and all of those rights that we've mentioned on privacy, on freedom of expression, on opinion, on association. As the internet moves into everything from transportation, as we've mentioned with Uber, to accommodation, that also brings in the right to housing, the right to water, the right to food, the right to healthcare, etc. So I think we need to think about that in a kind of current context of the regulatory proposals that are being introduced, plus also what is the future of the internet and the ability of users to be able to enjoy it.
Thank you, Brett. Alex?
Well, I want first to answer one of Raul's questions. What should we do with Uber? Well, use it because it's a wonderful service. What should we do with WhatsApp voice calls and video calls when they were available? Well, use it because they are great. And perhaps the price and quality regulation that are still in place is no longer needed. But new types of regulation appear, as some previous speakers have argued. Authorities should be able to stop by an Uber and ask a suspect a few questions. And authorities should be able to listen to what some suspects are talking through a WhatsApp call. I think that there is room for regulation in that aspect. And yet another type of regulation that I would like to mention is taxes and contributions. Because as Bertrand mentioned it in his first intervention, they're very relevant for stimulating the ecosystem. In Latin America, we were yesterday discussing how to connect the unconnected, because there are still 50% of the population that is not connected to the internet. And well, taxes and contributions play a fundamental role on helping to contribute those unconnected. Every company in every country in the world has to pay taxes. Well, because the world has changed and now we have global platforms providing services in all the countries without being present in those countries. Well, there is a big question and a difficult question. How should those companies pay taxes and contribute to universal funds? I don't know, the answer is very difficult, and that's a subject that has to be discussed. But from my perspective, there is room for regulation in that aspect too.
Thank you, Alex. And our last speaker is Bint Cerf.
Let me just respond on the tax question. Any company like Telefonica, which is global in scope, has the problem of dealing with a tax environment which is quite varied in every country that you operate. And so this is a really complicated problem. We all pay taxes, we just have to figure out how to do it in a global context. I want to offer a completely counterintuitive observation about dealing with some of the problems that have been discussed. I don't know how many of you are aware of the avalanche takedown. This was a major effort that took some 5 years with considerable cooperation across borders in order to take down this avalanche botnet. And what I consider to be important about it is that I believe this was a largely informal collaboration. Sometimes informality is your friend. We have another example of that in the Configure Worm working group, which was entirely informal. And the reason that that worked from the law enforcement point of view is that anyone that had something useful to say about it was invited to participate, whether it was an individual, a hacker, or a government-sponsored organization. So in the end, it may very well be that some of the cross-border problems that we face can be addressed in this informal way, and in the process, discover the best ways that we can to work together to deal with some of the harmful situations we find on the internet. So let's not discount informality as an important tool for figuring out how to solve some of these problems.
Thank you, Bint. We are almost running out of time, so I know that you have been patient enough. So I have 3 questions that you and the lady over there, and please be brief with your questions, please, and to allow the rest of the participants to make the comments. So, sir?
Rajesh Charya. I'm speaking on behalf of Internet Service Provider Association of India. Never the questions are wrong, what has been told right now. Our questions remains the same because we are also very much interested that into our country, the broadband penetration should be increased a lot. And we should allow all the OTT players to be available over there. But at the same time, we also have to see whether they are self-regulated And if they are not self-regulated, then automatically the regulation will come into the picture. The major thing what the intelligence agency asks us, and the same question I'm repeating what the Virat has asked, what is the difference between human rights and human lives? Because this is the question. When a terrorist use SMS, email, or telecom, it has been regulated, while at the same time, if you use Skype or WhatsApp messaging or call, it is not regulated. In a very recent court, in the court of law of court, WhatsApp has submitted an affidavit stating that the moment the user is deleting himself from the WhatsApp messaging system, all his data contents are getting deleted, and the WhatsApp will not be helpful to the enforcement agency in India to give any data for further investigation. To what you are saying that the cross-border, and what you are saying that the OTT should cooperate with the law enforcement agency, they have very clearly given this affidavit into the court that we will not submit any data if the user is getting deleted.
Thank you. We will take that as a comment more than a question. So thank you very much. Over there.
Hello, my name is Sita Laxmi. I come from HIVOS, Southeast Asia. I come from the global south, so you say. I would like to know one basic assumption, because when you say about, before we go to the full frontal of non-regulations or informal way, the way Vincent was saying, I would like to know one basic assumption of where we have to reassess. Is the internet equal? Because historically, internet is not equal. And I think it's also a fact that we have to see, also a fact that we have to address. That's why we have WSIS, we have this digital gap that we have to close the gap. So how about that? So how about how to make the global south also at the same level playing field with the international OTT? Because in our national dialogue in the Indonesia Internet Governance Forum, most local OTTs understand that it will be not really important, it will be not really effective for them to be also protected in the business and ecosystem, because it's not the same with the international internet as a global structure. But they also think that there has to be an affirmative action from the government when they are making regulations, whether it's informal or formal regulations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, so do you have a remote question?
Yes. Yeah, this is a remote question from the remote hub in Belgrade, Serbia. So they say, we are however somewhat confused that the years after the first discussions about OTTs, we seem to be still at the beginning. Lots of questions. Should we regulate? Who? How? Yet no answers. We wonder if comparing to the traditional telcos approach to regulation, the way towards regulation of OTTs should be evolutionary, or it needs to be revolutionary, into brackets, entirely new, thinking out of the box approach. That's by Vladimir Radnovic.
Thank you very much. That's an interesting comment, and I think that was addressed during the interventions that we have today. Finally, sorry, I know that we will need a second panel on this, but I'm sure that that's not going to be possible this year. We have selected one more question for that lady over there that was, sorry, no, over there. I'm so sorry.
My question will be brief. So, my name is Julia. I'm from the Youth Observatory, from the Youth at IGF, and relates to her question. It's basically about digital divide and how the panel sees regulation as a tool in potential for us not to regulate just the market competition, but also as a way to keep the nature of the internet as universal, as Vincent says, and in a perspective of different stakeholders affected by it, not only as a matter of OTTs between themselves, And in this sense, my question is, how can we use regulation to avoid having the internet reflecting a digital divide and the internet ecosystem reproducing these asymmetries we see in socioeconomic development that keep us apart in the physical world? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Is any of our panelists that we want? Bertrand? Yeah. You want to? No. If you want to, no. Okay.
I'd like to respond.
Perfect. Go ahead.
I'm a huge fan of eliminating the digital divide. I want everyone to be online. In fact, Eric Schmidt told me I'm not allowed to retire because I'm only half done. Only 50% of the world is online. Fortunately, electronics and physics and engineering are in our favor here. The cost of providing communication and the equipment that's needed is coming down. There are all kinds of new attempts now with low Earth orbiting satellites. Our Loon project in Sri Lanka and others are trying to find ways of reducing the cost of providing access to the internet. So that's one important element in solving the digital divide problem. The second one is getting people in the locations where there isn't any internet fully capable of operating pieces of the internet themselves instead of having somebody parachute in to do it. And so that means education, it means a variety of other infrastructure that has to be in place. But I'm confident, looking at the last 30 years or so, that this is a feasible thing to achieve. And so I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of the world up and online. Maybe not quite by the end of this decade, but certainly by the middle of the next one.
Thank you. So our time for this roundtable or panel has expired, but well, thank you very much for your participation. Thank you very much to the panel. I think it was brilliant, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.